Okay, thanks to our tech guys back there. I'm not sure. My thing is advancing. There we go. Are you doing that, or did I do it? Yeah. You want to trade with me? There you go. Okay, thanks. Well, good morning, everybody. I'm going to use this microphone right here. Okay, I had a lapel on, but I'll just use this one here, and I'll stand close since my monitor's right here. This morning in our Bible class, we talked about reading novels or mysteries, and one of the problems some of us have is I get started with it, and I want to know how it ends. So I jump to the very end of the book and read the final chapter, and then I'm okay reading through the story. So that's kind of what we're doing this morning in our lesson. In our class time, we were introduced to the story of Joseph in Genesis chapter 37. And in our lesson, we're going to jump to the very end. So there's a lot of stuff in between, but I'll have to come back a couple more times to pick up those lessons. But this morning in our class, as we're introduced to the family of Jacob, and specifically to the young man Joseph, we learned that he was 17 years of age, and there's conflict within this family. He gives bad reports to his brothers, so they don't like him. He's a dreamer, and he talks about how there's coming a time when they will bow down to him, not only his brothers, but also his parents. And as a result, they hate him more. And the hatred gets to be so strong that when Jacob sends Joseph to check on the brothers who are a long ways off, grazing their sheep and their goats, they see him coming and they hate him so much, they want to kill him. Reuben tries to spare the life of Joseph by devising a plan, throwing him into a pit. Later on, he will release him and take him back to his dad. But that plan never happens. I mentioned in our class that the storyteller walks us through the story, and each of these scenes he introduces with the word come. I gave you two, but I didn't get to the third one. So here's kind of how the story, the dad says, "Come, I will send you to them." That's verse 13. The second come is in verse 20. The brothers see, and they say, "Come now, let us kill him." And then the third come is verse 27, "Come, let us sell him." So those are the three comes as we walk through the story, as that word becomes very important. Well, Joseph will be sold, and at the age of 17, and as we mentioned in our class, he will spend the rest of his years in Egypt. He will never go back home. And Joseph lives to be 110 years of age. I've often wondered in those years if Joseph ever thought he would see his family again. Any of you, have you ever watched this series on TV called Long Lost Families? Anybody ever seen that? I don't know what channel it comes on. It's probably History Channel or something like that. But I've watched about 6 or 8 of these episodes. These are stories about families that were separated. Sometimes at birth because of difficulties. The mother may have been a young mother, felt like she couldn't care for this infant. And so she gave the child away, adopted the child out. And now this baby becomes an adult and is looking for that birth mother or that birth father. Sometimes the stories are about siblings, brother or sister, or maybe sisters, or brothers that were separated at birth. They went to different families. They were raised in different families, but now they're adults. And they learned somewhere along the line that there's a possibility they have another sibling. And so there are some people brought in, I would call them experts, and they get on Ancestry.com, and through some marvelous tools, they're able to track down these things. If you've ever watched that, you ought to Google it, and you can probably watch some on the internet, Long Lost Families. But as you can imagine, when the families are reunited, there's a lot of hugs and a lot of tears, a lot of moments just of silence when they are just in each other's arms. I've watched a couple of episodes where the hurt is so deep into these children, and now adults. They don't understand why they were given up. They don't understand. Some of them felt like they were abandoned. They don't understand all of this. And all of these years, maybe 12, 13, 20, maybe 30 years or more, they lived with this hurt and this question, why did you do this to me? And so, always when they have located the long-lost parent or sibling, there's always this question, do you want to see them? Do you want to see them? And as you can imagine, most of the times, the answer is, yes. Yes, I want to see that brother or that sister or that parent. But there's been a couple of times when I've watched these episodes and that question was asked, the individual said, no, I don't want that person to be in my life at all. A brother or sister, or usually it's about a parent. Here it is. Joseph, 22 years in his life have gone by, and in our story today, these 10 brothers, the ones that wanted to kill him, and the one now that wants to sell him as a slave, these brothers, 22 years later, are standing in front of him. And for 22 years he has lived with this hurt. Why did they do this to me? How could they have hated me so much that they wanted to kill me and then they ripped this robe from me and they tied my hands and they threw me into this empty well? Why did they do that? I've entitled my lesson, Revenge Feels Good. You ever said that? I want to get even. Someone hurts you. Someone does something against you, and there's something inside of us that says, I want to get even. I want to get back. I want to be honest with you. I think Joseph was there a number of times. And even now, as these brothers are standing before him, I think part of him is still there. Revenge. We'll uncover that in just a minute. Revenge feels good. But then, what? Revenge. I want to tell you a story. It's an old story. You can Google this and maybe learn more if you'd like to. But in 1882, in New York City, there was a businessman by the name of Joseph Richardson who owned a narrow strip of land on Lexington Avenue. This piece of property that Richardson owned was 5 feet wide and 104 feet long. Now visualize that. That's a skinny piece of property. 5 feet wide, 104 feet long. Now, another businessman from New York City, his name was Hyman Sarner, owned a normal-sized lot, but it butted right up to Richardson's skinny piece of property. And so Sarner, the one that had the normal-sized lot, wanted to build apartments that fronted Lexington Avenue. So he went to Richardson, the owner of the skinny piece of property, and offered him a pretty good price, $1,000 in 1882, which was a pretty good price for this 5 feet, 104 feet long piece of property. But Richardson was deeply offended, he said. He demanded more money. As a matter of fact, he demanded $5,000, an absurd amount. Well, Sarner, of course, refused to pay that amount. Richardson called Sarner a tightwad and slammed the door on his face. I think that might have been the end of the story, but it continues. Time went by, and Sarner assumed that this little skinny piece of property owned by Richardson would remain vacant. And so he instructed his architect to design the apartment building with windows overlooking Lexington Avenue. Now, when Richardson saw this finished building, he was extremely mad. And he resolved to get vengeance. he was going to block the view from that apartment complex to Lexington Avenue. No one was going to get a free view over his piece of property. So 70-year-old Richardson built a house. Yes, he built a house. 5 feet wide and 104 feet long and 4 stories with 2 suites on each floor. Upon completion, he and his wife, I'm sure this wasn't her choice, but he and his wife actually moved into one of the suites. So I want you to look at the pictures up here, and I want you to be able to see this building. This on your left is kind of the side view, and you probably can't make it out very much. You can see the apartment that Sarner built, and then this little house that Richardson built. This is a little bit better view. Can you see this one on your right? Can you make out 2 distinct buildings? The one on your right, you can see one is like what you would expect in 1882. But there on Lexington Avenue, overlooking Lexington Avenue, was the house that Richardson built. Do you know what they called this building? The media, those that did the reports, they called it the Spite House. He built this house in spite or for vengeance. Let me tell you a little bit about this Spite House. The building Richardson built, he spent the last 14 years of his life in this building. Now, when the house opened, reporters showed up because they were pretty interested to see what this tiny house looked like. And here's what they wrote. Only one person at a time could walk up the stairs or pass through the hallway. The largest dining table in any of the suites was 18 inches wide. What do you think? About like that? The stoves were the smallest made. A newspaper reporter that was doing this report, he's described as a man of some girth. You know what that means. He was a little bit heavy. He was a man of some girth. He once got stuck in the stairwell. And after 2 tenants were unsuccessful in pushing him free, he exited only by stripping down to his undergarments. So the report said. Richardson spent the last 14 years of his life in the narrow residence that seemed to fit his narrow state of mind. The Spite House was torn down after Richardson's death in 1915. And at the very end of this little article, it says, revenge builds a lonely house. Space enough for usually one person, and the lives of its tenants are reduced to one goal. What is that goal? Make someone miserable. And they often do, but it's themselves. Well, here is Joseph, 22 years later, and these boys, these brothers, are standing before him. Let's look at the story. Genesis 42. Now Joseph was governor over the land. It was he who sold to all the people of the land, and Joseph's brothers came and bowed themselves before him with their faces to the ground. You remember that dream, don't you? When Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he treated them like strangers and spoke harshly to them. I want you to put yourself in Joseph's sandals. He's lived with this hurt 22 years. It's hard to let go of hurt. Where do you come from? He said. And they said, from the land of Canaan to buy food. It's 2 years into the famine. And the famine has reached up into Canaan. And so they've come down to Egypt to buy food. And although Joseph had recognized his brothers, they did not recognize him. After all, Joseph looks like an Egyptian. He's a high official, the governor of the land. They have no idea who that person is. Joseph also remembered the dreams that he dreamed about them. Isn't it interesting, things trigger in our minds? I remember that. Sometimes God does that. Brings about events, triggers those memories, and we're thinking, so that's what that was all about. You ever been there? Lights began to come on. He said to them, "You are spies." By the way, this is a strong accusation. To be accused of a spy in Egypt was kind of like being a terrorist. You've come down here and you've come here to destroy us. So you are a spy. You've come to see the nakedness of the land. They said to him, "No, my lord, your servants have come to buy food. We are all sons of one man. We're honest men. Your servants have never been spies." But he said to them, "No, you have come to see the nakedness of the land." And they said, "We, your servants, are 12 brothers, the sons of a certain man in the land of Canaan. The youngest, however, is now with our father, and one, little do you know, it's the one standing before him, one is no more." But Joseph said to them, "It's just as I have said to you. You are spies. And here is how you shall be tested. As Pharaoh lives, you shall not leave this place unless your youngest brother comes here. Let one of you go and bring your brother, while the rest of you remain in prison." That's quite a welcome, isn't it? In order that your words may be tested, whether there is truth in you, or else, as Pharaoh lives, surely you are spies. And he put them all together in prison for 3 days. You ever wonder what's happening to Joseph? Why does he do this? Joseph accuses his brothers of being spies, of being deceitful, not telling the truth. And he does it not once, but he does it 3 times. And eventually, he throws them all into prison. He knows the truth, yet he comes at them with these false accusations. Later, he will place their money back into their sacks, and then he will place his own personal cup into the sack of Benjamin. So what's this all about? You ever wondered? Joseph, why are you doing this? We need to see in this story that Joseph is human. When you live with hurt long enough like Joseph, you don't just walk through it very quickly. He's lived with it for 22 years. And now these brothers are standing before him. How will he respond? What will he do? Joseph is wrestling with himself. Do I take vengeance? Or do I let this go? But after 3 days, Joseph released all but one brother from prison. They returned to Canaan to report to their father Jacob. The brothers told him how Simeon was kept in Egypt as assurance or guarantee that they would return with Benjamin, the youngest brother. But I want you to hear the dad's response. Here's what Jacob says. In other words, they've come back and they said, Simeon is there, and this man, this powerful man, didn't believe us, so we've got to bring back Benjamin before Simeon gets released, before he gives us any kind of food. And here is this dad who's lived with all of this hurt. He says, you boys, you have bereaved me. You brought grief down upon me. Look what you've done. Joseph is no more. And now Simeon is no more. And now you want to take Benjamin? All of these things are against me. I think probably this is one of the darkest days in the life of a dad, when he sees his his children being gone. He's losing them. And he is struggling. Well, in the midst of all of this, there's a little light that begins to shine. I want to encourage us. Often this is the way that it happens. Sometimes when our lives are filled up with all of these crises, all of these problems, all of these struggles, and we think it can't get any worse. Hopefully we spend time in prayer, spend time with God, and then He lets us see just a little bitty light. Sometimes it comes through a word. Maybe it comes through His Word. That's why it's important that we feed on that Bible every day. But there's a light that begins to shine. And it comes through a person that you would never expect. Isn't that the way it is? The least person that we would expect to come alongside and maybe to walk with us and to help us shows up. And the person in this story is Judah. Now some of you may not remember this Judah, but it was Judah that not only wanted to kill him, but it's Judah that comes up with the plan, let's get some money for this boy. It's Judah's idea to sell Joseph as a slave. Keep that in mind. But when we began to see changes in the life of Joseph, I think also we began to see changes in the heart of Judah. But it's Judah. By the way, I just want to mention this to you, and then sometime today or during the week, I want to encourage you to read it. You ever wondered when you read Genesis 37 and you go through chapter 50, it's the story about Joseph. But you get to chapter 38 and something happens. It's not about Joseph at all. It's about Judah. It's a little story about Judah, pieced right in the middle of this Joseph story. I think that's a teaser to let us know that Judah made lots of mistakes. And you find a tremendous one there in 38. But Judah is also beginning to change. But it's this Judah. He stands before his father. He says, send Benjamin with me. We will arise and go so that we may live and not die because of the famine. I myself, look at this. I myself will be surety, a guarantee for him. From my own hand you shall require him. If I do not bring him back to you and set him before you, Dad, then let me bear the shame forever. That was Judah's request. That's a far cry from the brother that said, let's sell him as a slave. Let's get some money for him. And now here's this Judah that says, I'll guarantee you, I'll bring this boy back safely. He didn't do it with Joseph. But Judah's changing. So the brothers return to Egypt from Canaan, Benjamin in tow. Joseph invites them to dinner. You ever had one of those invitations that you're nervous about? You don't know the motives behind it? Why is this person inviting me to his house or out to eat? I think that's kind of what the brothers are sensing. What is he up to? Remember, they left and he accuses them of being spies. He invites them to dinner. They're fearful that it's not a good invitation. He asks about their father, and then Joseph spots his brother. Now remember, Joseph and Benjamin are the sons of Rachel, the one that Jacob loved the most. He sees his brother that he hadn't seen for 22 years. I think of these stories of these long-lost families, and I've seen brothers in those stories that have been separated for decades. And words cannot describe the emotions that overcome a person. So he sees Benjamin, and all of those emotions began to spill out. He says to his brother, God be gracious to you, my son. And then he had to leave the room. And while he was out, he wept. When I get to the end of my lesson, I want one of the themes running through Joseph's story is weeping. Life is tough. Life is hard. Life is hurtful. Sometimes we work through all of that by crying. Someone says it's helpful at times to cry your pain out. I think we see that in the life of Joseph. So he weeps. He cleans himself up, composes himself, then he returns back to this room. He eats and drinks and enjoys being with his brothers. Joseph sat them according to the birth order. They noticed it. They were puzzled, but they were confused. And then Joseph singles out Benjamin, just like Jacob singled out Joseph and said, "You are my favorite." It's almost like Joseph singles out Benjamin and says, "I'm going to treat you differently." So here's what he does. Every time the brothers got one helping of food, Benjamin got 5. Every time they got something, Benjamin would get more. The brothers noticed. It's interesting. The brothers noticed this special favoritism. But they didn't seem to mind. Not like they had done before. Maybe there's changing in all of these boys' lives. Well, Joseph loaded their sacks with food and hid his personal cup in the sack of Benjamin. They were barely down the road when Joseph's steward stopped their caravan. Said, "Someone of you stole the governor's cup." Of course, they all denied it. Their sacks were searched, and they found the cup in Benjamin's sack. Wow. They're overwhelmed with fear and grief, confusion. Once again, here are these brothers that are carted back to Egypt, and they stand before Joseph. I want you to picture this. Everything, they don't know how that cup got there. They don't know how the money got in there. They're struggling with trying to figure out, "God, what are you doing through all of this? We don't understand what's going on." They stand before Joseph. Maybe they see their lives pass before them. Maybe they think, "We're going to die. We're guilty. We don't think we're guilty, but here's the proof." So they stand before Joseph. And it is Judah. Now I want you to look at this. Judah steps forward. Remember, whoever sack the cup is in will be Joseph's servant, slave for life. That will be the penalty. Benjamin. But it's Judah that steps forward and says, "I'm going to take his place. Free Benjamin, and I will be your slave forever." Wow. Well, as we're seeing when Joseph is struggling with all of this, he can't make up his mind. You get a sense that Joseph's in the middle of a battle on the inside of his life. He can't make up his mind. He welcomes them, and then he weeps over them. He eats with these brothers, and then he plays tricks on them. He's at a war with himself. You see, these brothers, when they stood before him 22 years later, they peeled the scab off of one of his oldest and deepest wounds. And he would never let them do that again. On the other hand, these are his brothers. And he never wants to lose them again. So what will he do? Here are the choices. Get even, vengeance, revenge. You hurt me, I'm going to hurt you. You sold me as a slave. I was falsely accused. I spent all these years in prison for wrongdoings. They lied about me, and I'm going to get even with you. You hurt me, I'm going to hurt you back. You see that happening every day, don't you? We live in a world, people want to hurt each other because they've been hurt. Joseph was there. But he chooses to forgive. I don't want to pass this too quickly. Forgiveness is hard. to be honest with you, it's a lot easier to get even. Matter of fact, it feels pretty good. It's hard to forgive. And so I think we see Joseph vacillating between this. I think that's what's happening. Your spies. Throws them in prison. You see, forgiveness has good days and bad days. Someone described it as anger intermingled with love. I like that. We make progress only to make wrong turns. We take steps forward in forgiveness only to fall back into bitterness. But I want to encourage us, if that's where you are, struggling with forgiveness, some days better than others, I want to say you're on the right road. You're trying. You're trying. And that's all we can do is try and struggle with it. When it comes to forgiveness and letting go and releasing, all of us are beginners. As long as you're trying, forgive us our debts as we forgive those who have debts against us. Isn't that what Jesus teaches us to pray? I like that Lord's Prayer. I think there's nothing wrong with starting every day by saying that. Help us to learn how to forgive. Well, the story doesn't end there. I want you to know how hard forgiveness is. Not only for the one to give it, but also for the ones to receive it. 17 years. Now, you see, Jacob comes down with 70 of his family, and they spend the rest of Jacob's life in Egypt. Jacob, the dad, lives there 17 years, and he dies in Egypt. Now, after the dad is gone, the brothers get together, and they're still struggling with this. And Genesis 50, verse 15, says, "What if Joseph bears a grudge against us and pays us back in full for all the wrong we did to him?" You ever been there? Someone forgave you, but boy, you know how bad you hurt them. And you're wondering, how long does this forgiveness last? Was it genuine? Did they really let it go? And maybe now that dad is gone, maybe it's that person that maybe is keeping forgiveness in place, this sense of peace in family, but now that person is gone. What will the individual do? So 2 times Joseph reassures his brothers that they have nothing to fear. So it says they sent word to Joseph saying, "Your father left these instructions before he died." I don't know if he did or not, to be honest with you. Maybe he did. By the way, you ever think about the story, whenever Jacob saw his son Joseph, these boys had to walk through that lie? That would have been tough to stand before your dad and see your dad say, "Why did you guys lie? And you kept this as a lie all these years." I don't know. Maybe the dad did. Maybe Jacob did give instructions, knowing how violent and how hurtful this was. It says, "This is what you are to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servants of the God of your father." And when their message came to him, Joseph wept. Joseph wept. I went through the story of Joseph, and I kept underlining this word, weep. It's a really emotional story. Every time I read it, I weep. You know, Joseph wept when his brother stood before him. He wept when he saw Benjamin, his young brother. He wept when he saw his father Jacob for the first time after all those years. He wept when his father died, just fell in his arms and kept crying. He wept when his brothers came to him this time and said, "Please forgive us." And then his brothers weep. I think what I see in the weeping is this. Somehow through the weeping there is this sense of forgiveness that's taken place. That's this sense of releasing. Joseph never understood all these things, but there's something that he understood, and here's what he said. And this is how he could forgive. And this is how we can forgive. He said to his brothers, "Do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God?" Now hang on to that. God's behind all of this? God is behind everything that happened? Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me. Joseph doesn't hide it. You intended to harm me. But God intended it for good. God took the mess, or the messes, that you made, and He turned it into something good. Amazing. And Joseph looks back to all the hurts, looks back to that pit that he was thrown in, those times he was sold as a slave twice to Potiphar, to the Ishmaelites and then to Potiphar. He remembers those times he was thrown again into prison because he was lied, stayed there for a couple more years, he was forgotten. But now he's the governor of the land. 22 years. It begins to make sense. God was in it all. Now, I don't pretend to understand all this, because there may be messes in your life and you're trying to figure out where is God in the middle of all this mess. How can God ever take this situation and turn it into something good? But He can. So God can take the messes in our lives and turn it into something good. We know all things work together for good. Romans chapter 8. Hang on to that verse. I think that's the New Testament equivalent. We know all things work together for good to those that love the Lord and are called according to His purpose. So, how do you forgive? Here's how Joseph did. So he says, "Don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children." And he reassured them. And this is the idea. He continued to tell them this. Not once, but repeatedly. He continued to reassure them, and he spoke kindly to them. I come away from the story of Joseph with a couple of very important things. All of us are going to go through hurts and rejection. People are going to mess our lives up. We're going to mess them up ourselves. But hang on to this truth. God will never leave you. And He will be with you even in the mess. And so when you're in the middle of these messes in life, these hurts in life, don't give up on God. And don't blame God. If anything, in the middle of the wilderness, run to Him. Fall in His arms. Spend more time. And if you're having a hard time forgiving, just think of how often we need to be forgiven. And our model, I think, is Jesus. There were 7 sayings on the cross, but don't forget this one. For those that killed Him, spat upon Him, bruised Him, Jesus looked at them and He says, "Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing." Forgiveness is tough, but it's the right choice. Choose forgiveness, not bitterness. Let that go and hang on to God's hand. He'll help us through it. I don't know where you are in your life. We're going to sing this song, "There's a Stranger at the Door." It's an invitation to come to Jesus. Let Him be a part of your life. And then walk with Him and let Him change our lives. So let's stand as we sing this song.